My name is Ricardo. I spent decades believing that a man's greatest pride is being able to open the door of his own home and see his family gathered around the table. I built every brick with effort, every wall with sweat, every detail with the hope that my children and grandchildren would call that place home forever. But one day, standing before the very door my hands had raised, I heard words I will never forget. Screams coming from inside the house, familiar voices echoing with a cruelty that cut through my soul. "You don't belong here anymore, go away." The doorknob turned in my hands, but the door was locked from the inside. I stood outside, alone, my heart aching. I stared at the shuttered windows and felt as if I'd lost everything. Not just a roof over my head, but my very dignity. There I was, an old outcast standing on the street like a stranger in front of the house I once called my own. The same house where I rocked my children when they were small, where I shared bread with my wife Clara, where I witnessed births, birthdays, and laughter. Now that place was expelling me, and the words echoed, repeated, sharp as knives. "You don't belong here anymore." But what they didn't know was that this sentence wouldn't be the end of my story. Because even though they tried to erase my presence, there was something bigger inside me that still resisted. And what happened next, they could never have imagined. I've always considered a home the symbol of a man's life. When I was young, I promised myself that I wouldn't let my wife, Clara, and my children live in rented accommodation, dependent on the goodwill of others. I worked tirelessly, saving every penny, and year after year I collected bricks, tiles, and lumber, all purchased with the sweat of my hands. I spent early mornings waking before the sun, walking miles to the nearest construction site, accepting any job. I was a bricklayer's assistant, a porter, a laborer, anything that came my way. There was no small task when the goal was big. I'd say to Clara, "One day we will have our own roof and our children will grow up safe under it." She smiled, even though she was tired, and believed me. I remember the day we built the first wall. Clara made a simple coffee and brought it to me in a cracked glass. I drank it, looking at those still unplastered walls, and felt as if it were the most beautiful palace in the world. It was ours. It was the beginning of everything. Over time, each room took shape. I made a point of creating a special space for each child. I painted the walls with my own hands, choosing colors that suited each of them. I made makeshift furniture and arranged everything carefully so that no one would ever say the home lacked love. And there we raised our children. There we celebrated birthdays with simple cakes, but filled with laughter. There I watched my boys learn to ride bikes in the backyard. There I taught my girls to plant flowers in the front garden. Every memory was etched in that house, in every corner, in every brick. That's why when they locked me out, it wasn't just a father's rejection of his children. It was as if they were ripping my entire life away from me, as if to say that all my sacrifices, all the sleepless nights, all the sweat I'd shed, were worthless. And here the phrase, "You don't belong here anymore," in front of the door that my hands raised was like having my heart torn into pieces. As the years passed, my children grew up, and the house, once filled with laughter and hustle and bustle, began to change its sound. What was once a celebration and togetherness turned to silence, doors slamming, and harsh voices. I gradually realized that there was no longer the space for me that there once was. The signs were subtle at first, small comments that made me feel out of place. "Father, you don't understand these things. Let us take care of it, you're just getting in the way." I smiled, trying not to show the pain, but each word was like a nail to the heart. The same yard where I had taught my children to ride bikes now felt like forbidden territory to my aging hands. Clara had already left, and with her absence the air in the house grew colder. She was the bond, the heart that held us together. Without her, I saw the cracks in the family turn into walls. I began to notice that my opinions were no longer being heard. I would speak, and it seemed no one was listening. Even my grandchildren, influenced, would repeat harsh phrases without realizing it. Grandpa just sits there and does nothing. It hurt more than any physical exertion I had ever done in my life. The worst part, however, was noticing the indifference in their eyes. It wasn't just words or actions. It was as if my presence were uncomfortable. I, who had dreamed of seeing generations gather under the roof I'd built, was now treated like an inconvenient visitor. I began to hear conversations behind the door. My daughter-in-law's comments, muffled but clear. He's already too much of a nuisance. This house isn't his anymore. My heart sank, but I still kept quiet. I told myself it was just a phase, that love would win in the end. But deep down, I was beginning to understand that something worse was coming. It was as if little by little I was being pushed out of the house that had once been my greatest pride. Situations that had previously been just subtle comments began to turn into overt, visible, impossible to hide humiliations. I was no longer just ignored. I was treated like a burden, like someone who bothered them. I remember a family dinner. The table was laden with colorful dishes, and the smell of food wafted through the house. I sat in my usual corner, silent, happy just to see everyone together. But as I reached out to serve some meat, I heard my daughter-in-law's firm voice. "Leave it to the younger ones, Mr. Ricardo. You don't need much." Those words hit me hard. I swallowed, put my fork back, and forced a smile. My children remained silent, pretending not to have heard. Only the children laughed and ate, oblivious to the pain consuming me. Another time, I offered to fix the kitchen door, which was sticking. I still remembered how to hold a screwdriver, still had the strength to fix small things. But my youngest son shook his head and said in front of everyone, "Dad, you don't understand these things anymore. You'll end up broke." The silence that followed was worse than the sentence. Everyone lowered their eyes, but no one defended me. I slowly got up and returned to my room. There I sat on the edge of the bed and looked at my calloused hands, the same ones that had built every wall in that house. Now, treated as useless. And the cruelest blow came from one of the children. Running down the hallway, I heard my grandson repeat something he'd surely heard from the adults. "Grandpa is just a nuisance. It would be better if he didn't live here." I stopped, breathless. I didn't blame the child, but I felt the knife cut deep. These weren't just loose words, they were reflections of what was already spoken freely at home. That's when I realized with clarity. This wasn't just a passing inconvenience. I was being, little by little, pushed out of my own home. The rejection that had previously been veiled began to take shape before my eyes. It was no longer just joking phrases or impatient glances. It was explicit, direct, impossible to deny. One afternoon, I arrived in the living room and found everyone gathered talking in low voices. When they noticed me, they suddenly fell silent, but it was too late. I had overheard part of the conversation. My daughter-in-law said coldly, "He takes up space, he's just a hassle. This house isn't his anymore." My son didn't correct her. He just lowered his head in complicit silence. In that moment, I felt like the floor had fallen away. The same room where I'd told them stories when they were children, where we'd laughed together on Christmas Eve, was now the place where they plotted my exclusion. Another time, while trying to join a conversation, I heard my daughter say, "Father, you don't understand. You no longer belong to this time." It was these words that began to shape the wound that would later be completely opened. "You don't belong here anymore." I began avoiding the living room, the kitchen, and the spaces in the house I had built myself. I spent more time in my bedroom, alone, staring at the walls I had painted years ago. I asked myself, how is it possible to be a stranger in one's own home? How is it possible to be a stranger in the home that my hands raised? Their every gesture told me that my presence was uncomfortable. The plate placed after everyone else, the sidelong glances when I walked slowly, the forced silence when I tried to remember old stories. And deep in my heart, I already knew. Soon these wouldn't be just words. The day they'd actually kick me out was approaching. That day arrived cruelly, without warning, but with the violence of thunder. It was a cold Saturday night. I sat in my room, listening to the distant voices in the living room. Laughter, music, dishes being served. A family dinner I wasn't a part of. I took a deep breath, struggled to my feet, and decided I'd at least join them for a few minutes. I didn't want a party, just company. I walked to the door, my steps slow, and when I turned the knob, I felt resistance. The door was locked from the inside. I knocked softly and said, "It's me, your father. Open up, please." There was a brief silence, followed by a muffled whisper I couldn't understand. I persisted. "I just want to sit with you for a bit." It was then that I heard the harsh, dry, compassionless voice, "You don't belong here anymore." The words echoed through the wood of the door like knives to my chest. I knocked again, this time desperately. "This is my house. I built it with my own hands." On the other side, another voice answered impatiently. "Yes, you did, but your time has passed. Now this house is ours. Go away." I felt my legs give out. I held onto the wall, gasping for breath. I looked at the closed door and realized it wasn't just the wood separating me from them. It was the cruel decision to erase me from history itself. I stepped out into the yard with shaky steps. The cold wind blew against my face, but the pain inside me burned more than the night chill. I looked at the lit windows, heard the muffled laughter inside, and realized I no longer belonged there. There, outside the house I had built, I felt the deepest loneliness a man can feel. It wasn't just being alone in the world. It was being a stranger in the home that should have been my refuge. And that night, with tears streaming down my face, I understood the cruelty of those words. "You don't belong here anymore." But what they didn't know is that God still had an outcome prepared for me. After that night, I stood outside my own house with the echo of the words, "You don't belong here anymore," echoing in my heart. I realized I couldn't just continue suffering in silence. If I accepted it in silence, it would be as if I had truly ceased to exist, as if all the years of sacrifice could be erased without a trace. The next morning, I woke up with my eyes still swollen. My body felt heavy, but there was something different inside me. A small flame, an indignation that wasn't just pain. It was also a desire to reclaim my dignity. I didn't want revenge. I just wanted the truth to be seen. I opened the old iron drawer where I kept old papers. I began rummaging through receipts, photos, letters, documents. There were fragments of an entire life. The contract for the first project I'd worked on as a construction foreman, the invoice for the bricks I'd bought to build those walls, the deed in my name, the photos of Clara smiling beside the still unplastered house. Every object I found was like living testimony that I belonged there. It was as if every sheet of paper screamed, "You are not disposable. You are the foundation of this family." I also grabbed a black-covered notebook forgotten in the back of the drawer. I decided to turn it into my exam diary. In it, I began writing memories. Nights when Clara and I ate only bread for dinner so there would be meat left for the children. Days when I worked in the sun until my hands bled. Choices I made that always put family above myself. As I wrote, tears flowed. But with them came a quiet strength. It was as if, by recording my life, I reclaimed part of who I was. I was no longer just remembering, I was preparing. And that day, looking at the black notebook and the pile of documents on the table, I whispered in a low voice, "They can lock me out, but they can't tear me away from the truth." It was the beginning of something bigger. I spent days reviewing the papers and photos and writing in my black notebook. Each memory I recorded seemed to reignite within me the flame they had tried to extinguish. But I knew that having evidence stored away wasn't enough. The time would come when I would need to speak out, and I needed to be ready for it. I began to rehearse my words in silence. I would sit on the edge of my bed, open my notebook, and read passages aloud, imagining my children before me. I didn't want to sound spiteful. I didn't want my words to be mere cries of pain. I wanted firmness, clarity, the strength of someone who doesn't beg for attention, but demands respect. He repeated phrases like, "You may have locked me out, but I built these walls. Every brick in this house bears the sweat of my brow. You said I don't belong here anymore. But the truth is you're only here because I once did." With each rehearsal, my voice grew stronger. At first it was shaky, choked with tears. Then it began to sound strong, steady, like the pounding of a hammer against wood. I realized I wouldn't just speak for myself. I would also speak for Clara, who was no longer there to defend the man she'd shared her life with. I would speak for every night we sacrificed, so our children could grow up without hunger, without cold, without fear. While I was writing in my notebook, I also began drafting personal letters to each of my children. Not hate letters, but letters of remembrance. In them, I recalled moments of love, sacrifice, and dedication. They were like mirrors I would hand them, so they could see themselves reflected in the ingratitude they had cultivated. In that process, something changed in me. I was no longer just the wounded man. I was becoming the man who would rise. The old man who, underestimated and discarded, would return with the truth as his most powerful weapon. Closing my notebook one night, I looked out the window at the sky and said, "Clara, my companion, prepare my heart, because they're going to have to listen to me." And for the first time in a long time, I slept peacefully. The nights began to transform into a time of silence and prayer. At first, I simply talked to myself, trying to calm the anger burning within me. But I soon realized there was no point in pouring it all out into the void. So, as Clara had so often taught me, I knelt beside my bed and began to speak to God. "Lord, what do I do with this pain?" He whispered. "They locked me out, called me an intruder in the house I built. How can I forgive this?" There was no immediate answer, but each time I prayed, I felt a gentle calm, like a breeze through a window. It didn't erase the pain, but it kept me from drowning in it. Over time, I began to understand something. My struggle wasn't just against my family's ingratitude. The biggest battle was against the resentment that threatened to take root within me. If I let it, it would consume everything that remained of my heart. Then my prayers changed. They were no longer just requests for justice, but for transformation. "Lord, do not let my heart harden. Give me the strength to speak firmly, but without hatred. Teach me to speak the truth without becoming like the cruelty I suffered." As I wrote in my notebook and rehearsed my words, I also jotted down verses and memories of Clara. Words she'd say when I came home tired from work. "The love we plant is never lost, Ricardo. It returns, even if it's by the hands of God." These memories became fuel. They reminded me that I wasn't just fighting to be heard. I was fighting to keep my life, and Clara's life, from being treated as nothing. And with each night of prayer, I felt something grow stronger within me. The man who had been cast out, humiliated, and locked away was no longer just a victim. He was becoming someone prepared to face it, not with hatred but with truth and faith. On the last page I wrote that week, I noted, "I will not fight to destroy. I will fight so that they may see. Vengeance is not mine, but the dignity that God gave me, no one can take from me." I closed the notebook, wiped away the tears, and realized I was ready for the next step. The following days were spent in silent waiting. I no longer lived on autopilot in my grief. Now, each morning was a rehearsal for what was to come. I knew I couldn't choose just any moment. It had to be in front of everyone, so there would be no more excuses or complicit silence. It was then that I received the news. There would be a family lunch the following Sunday. My daughter's voice rang through the phone with a certain coldness, as if it were merely an invitation out of obligation. But for me, those words were like a call. I understood immediately. That was where everything would happen. That night I sat at the table with the blue folder in front of me. I opened it slowly and examined every detail. The black notebook, filled with my notes. The carefully folded letters I'd written to each child. The receipts and documents that showed who had truly built this home. The old photographs of Clara smiling, holding her young children in front of the still unpainted house. I ran my fingers over each item as if caressing memories. Then I closed the folder and took a deep breath. It wasn't just paper, it was proof that I belonged there, and that no one could erase me. That night I knelt beside my bed and prayed once more. "Lord, this Sunday is not about revenge, it's about dignity. Give me courage to speak. Don't let my voice tremble. May my words not be meant to hurt, but to open their eyes." When I finished, I felt a different calm. It wasn't an absence of fear, but a certainty of purpose. I knew the moment was set. I looked at the folder which was resting on the chair and said in a low voice, "Clara, my dear, they will listen. This time, no one will silence me." And for the first time in a long time, I slept not as a defeated man, but as someone who was preparing for the most important battle of his life. Sunday dawned with overcast skies, as if even the weather sensed the weight of the day to come. I woke early, long before the neighborhood noise began. I sat on the edge of my bed and stared for a few minutes at the blue folder resting on the chair. Inside was my entire life, and also the key to the confrontation I could no longer postpone. I stood up slowly, put on the best shirt I still had in my closet, the one I'd worn to my first grandson's christening. I ran my hands through my white hair, straightened my collar, and for a moment I saw in the mirror not just the old reject they'd locked out, but the man who'd built a family from scratch. The man Clara loved. The father who never let bread go uneaten. I picked up the folder, held it tightly against my chest and murmured, "Today they will listen." Before leaving, I bowed my knees one last time. The prayer was short but sincere. "Lord, may my words be clear and may my heart not be filled with hatred. Give me courage." I left the house with firm steps, even though my body no longer had the same strength as before. The walk to the family home seemed longer than ever. Each step brought back memories. The day I carried bricks to build those walls. The day Clara hung new curtains in the window. The laughter of the children running around the yard. And at the same time, the wound burned. "You don't belong here anymore." When I arrived, I heard voices, laughter, and the clatter of cutlery. The scene was familiar, but I knew that today would be nothing like before. I took a deep breath, clutched the briefcase in my hands, and climbed the porch steps. I stopped in front of the door, the same one that had once been locked against me, and thought, now is the time. I turned the doorknob and walked in. The hubbub stopped the moment the door opened. Everyone turned to me in surprise, as if they hadn't expected me to have the courage to barge in like that, uninvited, without knocking. For a moment, the silence was so heavy that even the ticking of the clock on the wall seemed to echo through the room. There they were, my sons, my daughters-in-law, my grandchildren. The table was laden with dishes and clinking glasses, but no space was reserved for me. It was as if I were an intruder, a stranger who had just crossed the threshold of a house that, ironically, had been built by my own hands. I clutched the blue folder to my chest, took a deep breath, and took a few steps to the center of the room. Everyone stared at me in silence, some embarrassed, others frowning, trying to hide their discomfort. It was João, my eldest son, who broke the silence with a tense voice. "Dad, what are you doing here?" I faced him without fear. My voice came out firm, clear, without trembling. "I'm here because this is still my home, and because today you're going to listen to me." I placed the briefcase on the table, pushing aside plates and glasses without asking permission. The sound of the metal latch echoed as I opened it. The room, which seconds before had been filled with laughter, now resembled a courtroom. I looked each one in the eye. Their silence reassured me that I was on the right path. "You thought you could silence me, that by locking me out you would take away my voice. But today, in front of everyone, I'm going to say what I've kept inside for too long." My hands, despite my age, were steady on the folder. Inside was my entire life, and now, finally, they would have to face the truth. I opened the folder slowly, like someone revealing a treasure hidden for decades. The sound of the metal clasp echoed through the room, and I felt all eyes fixed on me. I took out the black notebook, the folded letters, and the old photographs I had so carefully sorted. I placed everything on the table, pushing the dishes aside. "Here is the life you tried to erase," he said firmly. "Every page, every leaf, every memory is proof that I belong here." I opened the notebook and began to read aloud. March 3rd, I worked 15 hours on the construction site. I bought the first bricks to build the house. Clara smiled when she saw the truck unload. She said, "Ricardo, this will be our home." I turned a few pages. August 12th. We sold our rings to pay for João's school. It hurt, but we knew he needed a better future. I looked up. The silence was absolute. Anna, my daughter, already had tears in her eyes. My daughter-in-law bit her lip in discomfort. João, rigid, seemed to be fighting his own shame. "You told me I don't belong here anymore," I continued. "But these pages prove that every wall in this house was built by my own hands. You called me an intruder, but this is my story. And no matter how many doors you lock, it cannot be erased." Then I picked up one of the cards and held it up. "I wrote these words for each of you. They are not of hate, but of memory. If you want to read them, read them. If you want to tear them up, tear them up. But don't say again that you didn't know how much it cost for you to be here today." My hands were shaking, not from fear, but from the intensity of the moment. I placed the letter on the table, looked at them, and concluded, "You tried to silence me. Today you're going to have to listen." I turned the notebook to one of the most tear-stained pages, the one I myself hesitated to write, but which carried the harshest truth of my life. I took a deep breath and began to read. In the winter of 1993, the food ran out before the month was out. Clara and I shared only bread and water for 3 days so the children could eat the thin soup that was left. Clara became ill from so much sacrifice. I hugged her and told her it would all be worth it, because we were building a future for them. And when I heard the children laughing and running around the house, I thought, even without food, it was still worth it. I closed the notebook slowly and looked at my children. My voice was choked but firm. Do you know what it's like to choose to go hungry so someone else can eat? Do you know what it's like to trade your own rest for the comfort of your children? Clara and I knew, and we never complained, because we believed that love and gratitude would be the answer. The silence was unbearable. Anna clutched a napkin so tightly it seemed to tear. João stared at the table, unable to look at me. One of my grandsons, confused, asked softly, "Grandpa, is that true?" I looked at him tenderly and replied, "It's true, my son. Every word." I picked up the notebook again and said, "And even after all this, I had to hear, you don't belong here anymore." Tears streamed down my face, but I didn't tremble. "So, look at me now and tell me, if I don't belong here, who does?" No one answered. The room, once filled with noise and celebration, was now plunged into shame and the weight of truth. I closed the notebook with a sharp snap, echoing through the room. I slowly scanned each face. No one moved, no one dared speak. It was as if everyone was frozen in the face of a truth they could no longer deny. I straightened my back, even with the weight of age, and said in a firm tone, "I will no longer accept silence. Today, each of you will look me in the eye and tell me, was it fair?" I looked first at João, the oldest. His face was filled with shame. His restless hands on the table betrayed his anguish. Finally, he raised his head and with a choked voice admitted, "No, Father. It wasn't fair. I heard the words they said against you and I kept quiet. My silence hurts more than any words, and I carry that guilt." My tears fell, but I remained strong. Then I turned to Anna. She was trembling, holding a crumpled napkin in her hands. "Father, I failed too," she said, sobbing. "How many times could I have sat beside you and didn't? I chose the comfort of pretending not to see. And today I realized that was even crueler." My daughter-in-law, who had remained motionless until then, lowered her head. Her voice was trembling, almost inaudible. "Mr. Ricardo, I was harsh. I said things I never should have said. I turned your presence into an inconvenience, when it should have been an honor." The weight of each confession filled the air. My grandchildren, confused, looked from one to the other, trying to understand why everyone was crying. One of them approached me, hugged my legs, and asked softly, "Grandpa, are you leaving our house?" I hugged him tightly and replied, "No, my son, because this house was born from me. You may have tried to exclude me, but I am a part of it forever." I looked up at the rest of the family and added, "Now you know, you can no longer run away from the truth." The room was plunged into a heavy silence, broken only by Anna's sobs and João's labored breathing. Everyone stared at me, as if awaiting the final sentence. I knew this was the moment to reveal not only the pain of the past, but also the choices I would make from then on. I opened the folder again and took out one last letter, different from the others. It was a yellowed sheet, written in my firm handwriting, but with no specific addressee. I held it up for all to see. "This letter is not for John, nor for Anna, nor for any of you in particular," I said firmly. "It's for the entire family. It's the sum total of everything I've experienced and suffered here." My hands were shaking, but my voice remained clear. "You locked me out. You screamed that I no longer belonged here. You tried to erase me from the house I built with my own hands. But what you didn't know is that, in doing so, you forced me to look within myself and discover a strength that doesn't come from you." I looked each one in the eye. They lowered their heads, unable to hold my gaze. I continued, "The truth is, I still belong. Not because you allow it, but because my life is engraved in every brick, every wall, every sacrifice that made this house exist. You can call me nothing, but what happened after all this, you could never have imagined." I carefully closed the letter, placed it on the table, and said in a deep voice, "What you will see from now on is not the humiliated old man. It is the man who has found his true strength. And that strength does not depend on your recognition." I stood up slowly, tucking the briefcase under my arm. The story doesn't end here. and I left the room, leaving a deep silence and teary eyes. They knew something bigger was about to happen. That night, back in my simple, quiet room, I closed the door behind me and placed the blue folder on the table. The weight of the confrontation still rested on my shoulders. I had spoken. I had shown the truth. I had forced each of them to face their own flaws. But instead of a sense of victory, what I found inside was a strange emptiness. I sat up in bed, ran my hands over my face, and let out a deep sigh. I thought of Clara, how often she'd say to me in her calm voice, "Ricardo, there's no point in winning on the outside if you lose on the inside. True victory lies in not letting your heart be consumed by hate." Those words came back to me like a well-aimed arrow. I had said everything I needed to, yes, but I realized there was still a risk. Resentment. If I wasn't careful, it would become a prison even worse than the locked door of my own house. At that moment, I found no strength within myself. So for the first time in many years, I knelt there on the cold floor and began to pray quietly. "Lord, you know how much it hurt to be rejected. You know how much it hurt me to hear that I no longer belonged. But if all I seek is for them to suffer, then I am no different from them. I don't want revenge. I want peace." As the words fell, tears began to flow. They weren't tears of anger, but tears of surrender. I was tired of carrying that pain alone. It was there on my knees that I felt something that didn't come from within. There was no bright light, no extraordinary sound, just a gentle presence, like a warmth that spread through my chest. For the first time in a long time, loneliness didn't crush me. It was as if someone were saying to me, "You have always belonged to me." I looked up with teary eyes and realized I was not alone. In that room, I had found the one who would never lock me out. And it was at that meeting that the real turning point in my story began. The next morning, I woke up different. My body was still the same, tired and heavy, but inside me there was a peace I hadn't felt in years. It was as if the harsh words echoing in my mind, "You don't belong here anymore," had lost their strength. They were no longer currents. They were just distant echoes. I stood up slowly, washed my face, and looked in the mirror. For the first time in a long time, I saw my own eyes without that shadow of bitterness. There was a man marked by wrinkles and time, but also someone restored by something greater than any rejection. As I drank coffee, I opened the black notebook again. The notes were still there, recording nights of sacrifice and tears. But now, as I reread them, I felt not just pain. I felt gratitude. I realized that every sacrifice, every difficult choice, every drop of sweat had not been in vain. All of it was proof that I had loved. And those who truly love never lose. It was at that moment that I understood the message God had whispered in my heart that night. My worth did not come from their recognition, but from His love for me. And that changed everything. For the first time, I looked at my family without the weight of resentment. They weren't just those who had hurt me. They were lost people, blinded by haste and ingratitude, who needed the same grace I had found. The resentment began to melt like ice in the sun. I picked up one of the letters I'd written, reread every word, and smiled. I decided I wouldn't deliver it as an accusation, but as an invitation. An invitation for them to see not only the pain they'd caused, but also the transformation God had wrought in me. With a lighter heart, I murmured, "Clara, my dear, you were right. Victory lies not in the cry of revenge, but in the power of forgiveness." And I realized that if I really wanted to change the history of my home, I needed to bring them what I had received in the solitude of my room, Jesus. The following Sunday, I decided to return home. I wasn't sure how I would be received, but something inside me told me I no longer needed to be afraid. I took the same blue folder with me, not as a weapon of accusation, but as a testament to my life. When I walked through the door, I noticed the tension in the air. My children stood there silent as if still carrying the shame of the previous confrontation. Anna lowered her eyes when she saw me. João stood still, trying to hide his anxiety. My grandchildren ran to me, innocent, hugging my legs. I held them affectionately and then looked at everyone. I placed the folder on the table but didn't open it. I sat down calmly and spoke in a calm voice. "Last week, I told the truth. I showed you the wounds, the sacrifices, the memories you tried to erase. I made you face what you chose to forget. But today I didn't come to repeat that. Today I came to say something else. Everyone watched me silently, attentively. I took a deep breath and continued. I could have chosen to hold a grudge. I could have let anger consume me to the end. But that night alone in my room I met Jesus. And he showed me something that changed everything. Forgiveness is stronger than rejection. I saw Anna's eyes fill with tears. João looked away, but he couldn't hide the trembling in his jaw. You told me I didn't belong here anymore, I said. But Jesus told me, you've always belonged to me. And it's in that belonging that I've found peace. So today before you, I choose to forgive. Not because you deserve it, but because I was forgiven first. My words fell like a weight upon them, but not a weight of condemnation. It was the weight of grace. My grandchildren, not understanding the depth, smiled and said, Grandpa, we love you too. And in that moment, I realized the turning point wasn't just in what I said, but in what God was beginning to do within them. The words hung in the air, as if time itself had stopped. The silence was broken by quiet sobs, first from Anna, then from my daughter-in-law, who had always been so hard on me. She brought her hands to her face and murmured, through her tears, I don't understand how you can, after everything we said, everything we did, how can you look at us without hatred? I looked at her serenely. It's not me, my daughter. I wouldn't have the strength. It was Jesus who entered into my pain and gave me a new heart. João, who always tried to maintain a firm, manly demeanor, couldn't resist. His tears flowed uncontrollably. He stood up, came to me, and knelt at my feet. Father, I was a coward. I heard everything. I saw everything. And I kept quiet. But if you are capable of forgiveness, then I need to learn too. Teach me to start over. My hands trembled as they rested on his head. It was the first time in many years that I had seen him broken before me. And I realized that it wasn't just my son humbling himself. It was God restoring bonds that pride had destroyed. Anna came soon after, hugging me tightly. Father, I promise, I will never leave you alone again. I want you to forgive me. But above all, I want to learn to live the same love you are living now. Even my daughter-in-law, through tears, asked for forgiveness. She said she now saw what she never wanted to see, that the presence of a father, of a grandfather, is not a nuisance but a living legacy. My grandchildren gathered around me, hugging me and repeating over and over, "We love you, Grandpa." And I understood. The miracle that had begun in the silence of my room was spreading throughout my family. The resentment that had once dominated was giving way to repentance, reconciliation, and the love that comes not from us, but from God. I smiled with tears in my eyes and said out loud, "What you see here today is not my strength, it is Jesus. He was the one who lifted me up when you all threw me to the ground." And in that moment, I knew for sure. The story that began with rejection was being rewritten by grace. The room where I had so often heard the heavy silence of rejection was now filled with tears, hugs, and words I never imagined I would hear again. My children, who had once locked me out, now surrounded me as if trying to make up for lost time. My daughters-in-law, once cold and hard, wiped their eyes and begged for forgiveness. And my grandchildren, innocent, hugged me without letting go, repeating, "Grandpa, we will never leave you alone again." My heart, which had so often bled in silence, now beat in peace. I looked at each of them and said, "You told me I didn't belong here anymore. But I discovered that my true home was never just this house. My home is in God. And it was He who taught me that if I truly wanted to restore my family, I needed to choose forgiveness. My words weren't accusatory, but surrendering. They weren't walls, they were bridges. And I could see in their eyes that something had changed. The weight of regret crushed them, but the light of forgiveness began to illuminate each face. João held my hand and spoke in a choked voice. "Father, you showed us today that love is stronger than pride. We treated you like nothing, but God used this to show us that you are all we truly have." I felt the tears fall again, but this time they were different. Not of pain, but of gratitude. "Then understand, my children," I replied. "A man's worth is not determined by his family's opinion, nor by the comfort of a home. A man's worth comes from God, who transforms rejection into testimony and pain into forgiveness. In that instant, I knew that the phrase that hurt me so much, "You don't belong here anymore," had lost its power forever, because now in their hearts and in mine, the truth was different. I did belong, but above all, I belonged to Christ, who never locked me out. I smiled, looking at the sky through the window, and silently murmured, "Clara, my dear, we did it. They kicked me out, told me I didn't belong anymore. But what happened next changed everything. And in the next chapter, you'll see how God transformed not just my life, but my entire family."